Okay, hello, I'm Rachel Andrew. I've been working on the web since about 1996, which means I'm kind of pre-CSS. And I also was building websites using CSS for Layout back when Netscape 4 was a thing. And CSS has really moved on a very, very long way, and we'll be seeing later on today, you can use CSS to do animations, which is kind of unthinkable when I started on the web. But despite all of those advances, we've pretty much been stuck with antiquated ways of doing layout. Layout on the web hasn't moved on very well at all. And while we can all do layout with the tools we've got, we spend an awful lot of time as developers dealing with that, dealing with learning which sort of weird ways we're going to manage to do layout at different breakpoints for responsive design. Often these layout methods come at a cost of us being able to have very semantic documents. We're kind of having to mess around with the source in order to get the layout that we want. They're coming at a cost of us leaning on frameworks increasingly in order to do layout. We're using frameworks to kind of abstract away the maths, to actually get rid of the complexity of doing layout. And layout shouldn't be as difficult as it is. And so things are changing. We've got 3 specs that are moving through the DOE3C at the moment, and some of them are available in browsers already. Flexbox, we've got CSS Grid, and we've got the box alignment module level 3. And these 3 specifications taken as a group are really going to redefine the way we do layout on the web. But they sort of mean we need to think quite differently about layout. And when we start talking about the new layout modules, we tend to think in terms of the problems they will solve for us. And they solve these problems because they've got some specific characteristics. They properly separate the document source from the presentation. They give us true alignment control. They let us center things horizontally and also vertically. They're responsive by default. They mean that we don't need to start calculating strange percentages in order to work out the widths of our columns. And most importantly, they give elements on our page relationship to each other. So one thing on the page knows that another thing on the page in that layout exists. And this is really important because a lot of the issues we have with our existing layout methods are because when we position an element on the page, it's kind of just it on its own. It doesn't know anything about the other elements around it. If I float 2 blocks, one left and one right, and one of them is a different height to the other, I just don't have a way of telling the left-hand block to go to the height of the right-hand block. We just don't have a way to do that. And we've been trying to create these full-height columns for years. Anyone who's old like me will remember faux columns. And basically, we were tiling an image to create the sort of visual effect of a full-height column. Of course, there wasn't a full-height column, there was an image there. And once we moved on to responsive design, these kind of fragile techniques really became a problem, and we're trying to work out how to do that and still have flexibility. The reason why people jumped on this sort of display table idea in CSS was because display table gave the elements in the layout a relationship to each other. It made them behave as if they were in an HTML table, and one thing could relate to another. And that's why display table worked so well for us. But those full-height columns are pretty much the basic behavior of things like Flexbox and Grid. So this is a simple Flexbox example. It takes advantage of the initial default values of the Flex properties. So we've got a sidebar and a container that are inside a Flex wrapper. The sidebar runs to the height of the content area. The background color there extends all the way down to the bottom of the content, rather than sitting up behind the text, as it would if it was a floated column. This is the same example, but using CSS Grid Layout. So I've created a grid on my wrapper element. I've positioned my sidebar using line-based positioning, starting at column line 1. My content starts at column line 2. And in all of these examples of new layout, this idea of elements understanding themselves in the context of a wider layout is really important. So something we've talked about really ever since those early days of CSS for layout is this idea of separating the visual display from the content and the HTML source. It was pretty much the rallying cry of the CSS for layout movement. We were trying to explain to our friends who were using nested tables why our way was better. And it's kind of been a bit of a failed promise, really, especially once responsive design came along, because although we might be able to separate the display from the HTML at one presentation of the content, once we start looking at how we're going to display it at mobile or for tablet and moving things around, we're often having to make compromises either with the source or with the design. So if we take a look at Flexbox, so I've got some navigation here, and it's very simply laid out. I've used space between, so that Flexbox will assign the space left over between the items. And the flex direction property is set to row, which is the default behavior of Flexbox. You can also set it to column if you want to display your items in a column. Now I can switch the order of those flex items by setting flex direction row reverse. And you could also use column reverse to flip a column. We can go further than that because we could explicitly set the order using the order property. So if I've got a bunch of items here and they're displaying in source order in a flex container, I've given them all a number so you can see the number they actually are in the source. And so we can change the order. So now we've got the source ordered number 1 is visually number 3. CSS Grid goes a step further because it allows us to change the order of elements not just in one dimension, but in 2. So if I've got a parent element set to display grid, and I've got 3 columns there, I can then position the items with CSS Grid Layout. I'm using the grid column and grid row properties. The value before the / is the start line, and the value after is the end line. So that means I can position items around the grid in columns and rows, and it doesn't matter in which order they were in the source, I can just position them anywhere I like. The only constraint is that grid items, like flex items, need to be a direct child of the element that's got flex or grid declared on it. And as well as this ability to place items on a grid, Grid Layout also includes something called the auto-placement rules. And they allow us to take a chunk of content, a list, a stack of images, or whatever, throw it at a grid, and they'll just be laid out by themselves without us sort of positioning them in any way. So if I take the previous example and remove all this sort of positioning from it, I've got a grid, I've got some stuff, it'll just be laid out like this. Each item will go into a grid cell. If I add a few more images to that gallery, and some of them are portrait and some of them are landscape, and what I'd like to do is make the landscape images take up 2 tracks of the grid so that they sort of stay in proportion and don't have big holes in the grid. I've added a class to any of the LI elements that contain a landscape image. I'm then setting the grid column end value to span 2 lines. This will have the effect of making landscape images span 2 tracks, while the portrait ones will remain spanning 1. And the auto-placement algorithm will lay out the items. And sometimes, though, it's going to come across an image that's too wide. So we've got image 2 there, and then there's a gap, and then we've got image 3, because that wouldn't fit into that little gap, because it needs to span 2 tracks. So by default, grid progresses forward. It stays in source order. However, if we add a property of grid autoflow with a value of dense, grid will now backfill those gaps. It moves through the content, it finds an image that's too large, it takes up too many tracks, so it places that. Then if it comes across another image that will fit in the gap, it'll actually move back and place it into that hole. This is absolute magic. You can do marvelous things with this. It's also slightly scary. Because if you're someone who cares about accessibility, and I hope that everybody cares about accessibility, this idea of being able to place things independently of source order, that can be quite worrying. because our source order is very important in terms of other devices, accessibility devices, people who are tabbing around documents. And I think we've got an awful lot to learn about these new layout methods and how they behave with assistive technology and with other ways of accessing the web. And ideally, what these things should allow us to do is to have an accessible source document and worry about how accessible that is and how sensible and logical our document is, and then use Grid and Flexbox to display things at different breakpoints in terms of what makes most sense. I think there will be a temptation, which would be bad, would be to use Grid and Flexbox as an excuse to forget about the source, because, hey, you know, we can place things wherever we want. It doesn't really matter what our underlying document looks like. And I think even worse, because things need to be the child of a grid or flex item to be laid out on the grid or laid out with Flexbox, there will be a temptation to essentially strip out markup, flattening out markup, to allow things to sit nicely on the grid. And I think that temptation will be highest with authoring tools, visual tools that do this stuff. The DRU3C worry about this as well, and this is from the current Flexbox editor's draft. Now, orders shouldn't be changing how a document is read out in text-to-speech or change anything about the logical order. So we need to make sure that any reordering we do is just for visual purposes and doesn't do anything logically to the document. I've been particularly concerned about the flattening out of markup effect in Grid. There's actually in the spec a method by which we can allow the grid to be inherited by child elements. There's a subgrid keyword. Unfortunately, that isn't implemented in any of the browser implementations as yet, and it's flagged up as risk in the specification in the draft at the moment. If you're interested in accessibility and these new layout methods, this post I wrote sort of goes into some detail into the problems around that. So we've got relationship between items, and we also have this separation of content and display. And the other thing that Grid lets us do, and Flexbox, is to control alignment. Because it appears that one of the hardest challenges in web design is vertical alignment. And it's that our new layout methods solve. And it's in fact one of the first things people, when they come to Flexbox, get excited about. And here I'm going to mention a new player in this picture, and that's the CSS Box Alignment module. And this module, it's a new module, it's in draft, and it contains the features of CSS that relate to alignment. And if you know your Flexbox, basically what this module is doing is taking those Flexbox alignment properties and applying them to other areas of CSS. So that includes Grid, as we'll see, but eventually will also include block layout. So you should be able to vertically align things anywhere. So this is the vertical centering module, although it does an awful lot more than just that. So we've already seen this distributed alignment in a simple Flexbox example. So in Flexbox, we use justify content and align content to align items against each of the axes. So I've got some navigation here, it's in a row, and I'm using justify content with a keyword value of space between to line up my first and last items flush with the margins and distribute the rest of the space equally. If you change the value to space around, an equal amount of space is then placed around the items, so you get a sort of half-size gap on each end. By setting align or justify items on the Flex container itself, on the parent, we change the align self and justify self properties of the individual items inside. So as we've already seen, items in a Flex container have relationship. And by default, the value of align items is stretch, which means that our items stretch on the cross-axis and are all the same height, despite not containing content of the same height. So I've added some extra text here to one of these navigation points, and all the others go as tall as the first one, even though they've only got one line of content in. Another problem solved with one line of CSS is that we can do this vertical centering. So align items to center, and all the items center against each other. And if you switch flex direction to column, then align items center will center the items horizontally. Justify self and align self are used on individual items to change their alignment properties. So you can set something on the group, and then you can change on individual ones too. So I've made here the third item stretch rather than center. So at the moment, this applies to to flex items and also is coming into grid. But the idea is this stuff will eventually apply to all types of layout. And if you take a look at the box alignment spec, you can see how that's described for each type of layout. So as an example of how these properties work once they're applied to a different layout, we can have a look at how they work in grid. I believe this stuff is only just in Chrome Canary at the moment. It hasn't made it into Chrome yet. It's quite fun sort of following this implementation as things make it in. You can kind of see how it works and how these things are being ported over into a different kind of layout. So here I'm creating a grid and I'm setting align items to center. Now this grid has a repeating pattern of 5 150-pixel tracks separated by 10-pixel tracks. I've tied it up on the end with an extra 150-pixel track. And we've got 4 50-pixel rows separated again by 10-pixel tracks. And I'm then positioning my items, and each grid area spans 4 lines horizontally and vertically. So each of those 4 grid areas covers 4 squares of the background image. Now by default, the item would stretch and it would fill the whole square. But because we've set align items to center, the items center within the area, just like the flex items. And if we justify the items, we've got the same grid, same placement of individual items there, but we've set justify items to center, and we end up with this. So just like with Flexbox, we've got align self and justify self, so we can target individual items on the grid. And box A here is showing the default behavior. It's set to stretch. And then we've got one to self-end, self-start, and self-center. So we can start using this stuff right now in Flexbox, but they are coming to these other layout methods, starting really with grid, because that spec's in development. So being able to align groups and individual items is pretty much vital for responsive design. And it's where a lot of the sort of old school hacks that were kind of my stock in trade when I first started doing CSS Layout, those things started to fall down once we went responsive. And that's the other thing with these new layout methods. They are essentially responsive by default. So it was actually 2009 when Ethan Marcotte detailed in a list apart his technique for creating fluid grids. Because he'd been working with relative font sizes, and he noted that grids could essentially be treated in the same way. That if you divided the target width of an element by the width of the context, that would give a percentage, and we could use that percentage in our columns to make a fluid grid. And so it came to pass that we all started adding these very unlikely looking percentages into all of our layouts. And that's something that you don't really have to do once you're working with these new layout methods, because they work that stuff out for us. We've got in the spec things that allow us to do flexible layout. So that most simple of Flexbox examples involved taking a list of items, declaring display flex on the parent, and adding the justify content property with a value of space between. So that value flexes with the screen width. It adds and removes space as needed, and that's defined in the box alignment module. Flexbox goes further than this. It allows us to proportionately distribute space between our items. Now, the flex property is a shorthand for flex grow, which is adding space, flex shrink, removing space, and flex basis, which is the initial size of the element before all that growing and shrinking happens. And the latest Flexbox draft suggests we actually use the shorthand because it resets values to some sensible defaults. So here I'm setting flex grow and flex shrink to 1. That means that every box can grow or shrink to fit into the space available, but the ideal box width, the initial width, is 200 pixels. So we'll end up with 3 boxes of equal width. If I allow the items to wrap, when the boxes get smaller than 200 pixels, a box will wrap onto line 2 to try and maintain 200 pixels. Now the final box takes up all of the space on row 2 because that alignment is worked out on a row-by-row basis. The row's only got one item, so it's allowed to grow to fill all of the space. If you don't want your boxes to grow, you just set flex grow to 0. So if I go to a wide window size with that same layout, the boxes aren't going to get any bigger than 200 pixels. They will shrink. They'll go smaller because we're saying that's okay, but they won't grow. So it will still wrap if you go to too small, less than 200 pixels, but the box won't grow and fill the full line. And you can also target individual items. So if I add rule, say for box 3, so all boxes can grow and shrink from 200 pixels, but box 3 cannot grow. So this is what happens. Once the boxes have to stretch wider than 200 pixels, box 3 stays at 200 pixels. The other two get the rest of the space distributed between them because they're both set to 1. So this sort of thing is useful for layouts where you might have two things at either side or top and bottom that you don't want to grow and expand proportionately. You want them to kind of stay the same size. You want the rest of the stuff to take up the space. But there's more than this, because responsive design is about proportions. So in order that we can maintain proportions, we can assign different values to different boxes so that when things start to grow or shrink, they do that in the proportions that you've set. So here I'm setting box 3 to flex grow 2. The other two boxes remain at the default of 1. Now this doesn't mean that box 3 will become twice the size of the other boxes. It means that after the 200 pixel basis has been taken away from the available width, the rest of the space is assigned according to the flex grow value. So this box gets twice as much of the available space left than the other two. And if you want to work out how different Flexbox items might display with different values, this Flexbox tester is quite useful. You can put in different values and see what size it will actually end up as, depending on how much space there is. So Grid also has this flexibility built in, and to do it, it introduces a new unit, the FR unit. It's a fraction unit. And if you understand how Flex Grow works, then pretty much you've got an idea of how this unit will work in Grid. So it, like Flex Grow, allows you to assign a fraction of the available space. So I've got a very simple grid here. It's got 3 column tracks, all with 1 fraction unit as the width. So in the image below, you can see that's created 3 equal width columns. They've each got basically a third of the available space. So I can change the definition and create 1 600 pixel wide column and then 2 1 fraction unit columns. So Grid first gives the 600 pixel width column its space. It gives it 600 pixels. And then it divides the remaining space between the other 2 columns, so they each get half of the remaining space. If I change that last column there to 3 fraction units, that remaining space is now divided into 4 and shared between the boxes in proportion. So this, just like Flexbox, means we can create fully flexible layouts that have some fixed elements in them. Now this is just like the Holy Grail layout that we used to long for. So the Holy Grail layout, if you did liquid web design, was fixed sidebars and a liquid stretchy center. And the sort of thing we all wanted was to be able to get the central column first in the source order. And it turned out this was reasonably difficult to do with the layout methods we had. It usually involves sort of nesting divs and switching the columns around. Now this is something that obviously is fairly simple to do with Grid. And this is the other Grid syntax. This is the Grid Layout ASCII art layout, or Grid template areas. So here we're assigning a name to the different areas, and then we're actually laying it out as the value of the Grid template areas property. And you can actually see the layout essentially described in code. That's Grid template areas. And that gives us, yes, our Holy Grail type layout. So it's not really something that we want to do much these days, but it's nice to know that finally we can. So, browser support. Flexbox support is pretty good these days. And with Microsoft's recent announcement that they're going to drop support for IE below 11 in January next year, Hopefully we're going to see the back of the old Flexbox syntax, which is in IE 10. Modernizer is a really good option if you want to use Flexbox, and you can then detect what properties are available and fork your code accordingly. But unless you have to deal with an awful lot of very old browsers, there's an awful lot you can do these days with Flexbox, and particularly on mobile, you tend to find you've got a lot better support for your mobile devices if you split your browser statistics down. Grid. Interestingly, that's IE is where you will find grid at the moment, although it's actually an old syntax. The history of CSS Grid Layout is that the spec, the current sort of grid layout spec, the template areas stuff predates this. It's been hanging around for quite a while. But the spec we've got now really came from the Microsoft team. They implemented it in IE 10. It's in 11, and it's in the current version of Edge with an MS prefix. The spec that is now going through the W3C is quite different to that initial spec. I mean, there's an awful lot of similarities, but there's an awful lot of new stuff as well. So the up-to-date spec you will find is in Chrome and in Opera. It's in Blink, so it's behind a flag in those browsers. That work is being done by an open source consultancy called Igalia, and it's actually been sponsored by Bloomberg because they want the grid layout in browsers, and so they're sponsoring the work. So if you want to play around with grid layout now, you need to enable experimental web platform features flag in Chrome or Opera, and you can play around with the newest stuff. If you have Chrome Canary, there's some stuff going in all the time. That implementation is actively happening at the moment. It's prefixed in WebKit Nightlies. The WebKit work has also been done by Igalia, and I think that's a little bit behind what's in Blink, but not far. In the last week, we've been seeing grid layout stuff get into Firefox Nightlies. So if you download a nightly build, again, there's a flag you have to enable. But then that implementation is a little bit behind the Blink stuff, but it's nice to see it going in. And Edge are updating the current spec. They've got that as high priority on the backlog. So we're expecting IE to also update to the modern spec shortly. The W3C at the moment have asked for final comments from the community on the level 1 spec, because they're hoping to kind of finalize all the syntax and things so that browser vendors are happy to actually sort of finish their implementations. So if you want to have a look, I've got a website, gridbyexample.com. All of the examples that I've been showing you and lots more things I've been building are available there. All of that stuff works in Blink, so you can have a look, play around with it. If you've got comments, the working group are very interested in them, and I would be very interested in them, so you can always pass them on to me, and I can always post things to mailing lists or whatever. I'm going to be around today, so if you want to have a chat, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions, but do have a look at this stuff. It's really good fun to play with. Thank you very much.
Hello. Okay, so I have one simple question. If you don't need to support older browsers, is it clear to say you don't have to use a single flawed hack in your application at all to just make your grid work exactly like on the design?
Yeah. I mean, you should be able to, if you don't need to support older browsers, you should be able to do quite a lot of stuff with Flexbox. And obviously, Grid at the moment is behind flags. It's not actually out there in browsers, although hopefully it won't be too long. Yeah, I mean, you can use Flexbox now. Flexbox isn't ideal for all these grid, sort of real grid-style layouts, but you can, for simple layouts, you can do them with Flexbox. But yeah, I mean, hopefully in a glorious future, the days of float hacks are behind us.
Hi, a great presentation as always. I've got a question about the FR unit. We had something working quite like this as a unitless value in Flexbox, and now in Grid Layout module, the fraction unit is introduced. I think only then there. Are there any attempts to backport this unit to the Flexbox module, or we're going to use unitless values in Flexbox and fractional values in Grid?
Yeah, I had the exact same question at Frontiers, and I haven't yet managed to find out what the history of that fraction unit is and why, because I think that's I hadn't thought about it, but yeah, it seems odd that we have two different things. I'm going to try and find out what the sort of issue is there and why we have the fraction unit in one and the unitless value in the other. But essentially, they do behave in pretty much the same way. Although I guess with flex items, you're sort of describing space that's left as opposed to sort of saying this is the width of these columns. There's a slight difference there, a slight sort of technical difference in how they work. But yes, I don't know, because the fraction unit's only used in Grid. It doesn't appear anywhere else. I don't know whether there's hope for it to be anywhere else in the future. I'm not sure.